In the sacred city of Thebes, where towering obelisks cast long shadows across sun-baked stone, beauty and horror lived side by side, stitched into the same golden thread of empire. Beneath the grand temples of Amun-Ra, where priests wore clean linen and spoke of balance and order, another kind of offering was made each day, not of incense or carved ivory or baskets of figs and honey, but of flesh. Girls were the true currency of piety. They were not born into the temple, most of them. They arrived in silence. Some dragged, some carried, some traded like cattle. Others offered willingly by starving families in exchange for grain rations or forgiveness of tax debt. They were called Hanut Necha, women of the god, though few of them would ever see the gods they supposedly served. Most were between 11 and 15, chosen for their unblemished skin, their small hands, their wide eyes that still held the shimmer of fear that buyers found especially valuable. Once taken behind the temple walls, these girls were no longer daughters or sisters or wives-in-waiting. They were property, divine property. That label, once sealed, gave their owners complete legal immunity. Temple records from the reign of Thutmose III show daily inventory scrolls, where girls were tallied like livestock. 4 Syrian girls, 2 from Canaan, 1 native-born. All unbroken, 2 bled. 1 defective. Value adjusted. Defective meant rape too early. Value lost. The walls of the House of Women, a fortified stone enclosure near Karnak Temple, still bear faded red ink sketches, simple carvings showing hooded figures dragging what appear to be girls with shaved heads and chained wrists. These weren't artistic expressions. They were documentation. Temple scribes recorded everything. Every bruise, every first use, every failed pregnancy. Even blood was measured and noted. Inside the house, the girls slept on mats soaked through with discharge and river water. A central basin served as their only means to clean themselves, though it more often spread infection than removed it. They were divided by category: virgins, used, pregnant, diseased. The priests did not touch them, not at first. These girls were reserved for ritual duty, and those duties were far more cruel than the touch of a man. On certain nights, the full moon marked what priests called the renewal of life ceremony. In reality, it was a bloody spectacle designed to please both the gods and the elite men who claimed divine right to women's pain. Dressed in painted linen and smeared with oils, a girl would be brought to the sanctuary steps where offerings were made to Ra or Amun. Chants filled the air. Drums beat louder than her cries. She was not touched in secrecy. She was publicly broken. A scroll found in the tomb of High Priest Menkheperre, dated around 1450 BCE, recounts the first offering of a virgin girl named Satsubek. Her father had offered her to the temple to pay his grain debts. She was 12. The scroll, written without a hint of remorse, details how she was tied to a stone slab, stripped of clothing and hair, and made open by 4 temple guards before her blood was poured into a bronze bowl and mixed with wine. The mixture was considered sacred. Priests drank from it, so did nobles. Some accounts say even the pharaoh himself. The ritual was called Nekjesef, to loosen her spirit. It was believed the girl's suffering unlocked channels to the divine, but the ceremonies weren't the worst of it. Between rituals, the girls were rented out to wealthy scribes, officials, and foreign dignitaries as sacred companions. A euphemism so flimsy, it barely pretended not to mean forced concubine. The men paid the temple, not the girl. She never saw a single grain or coin. And if she refused or tried to escape, punishment was swift and brutal. Carvings on temple walls show scenes long misinterpreted as disciplinary rites. In truth, they are images of torture. Girls suspended by their wrists, legs bound apart, cuts across their thighs, sharp reeds inserted into them as punishment for disobedience. A papyrus from the reign of Amenhotep II describes a punishment called the sun's judgment, where a girl was stripped and tied to a pillar facing the sunrise for 3 days. She was left without food or shade. Priests called it purification. She died before the second sunset. Girls who survived the first few years were no longer desirable. Their value dropped. Their bodies had changed, sometimes from childbirth, sometimes from beatings, sometimes from disease. Temple physicians would examine them and decide whether to reassign them to kitchen labor, laundry, or burial preparation. Some were used in rituals involving animal sacrifice. Others became literal offerings, bled out in secret chambers beneath the temple floor, their blood painted onto statues, their hair woven into ceremonial wigs. One account from the private journal of a priest named Bekenu records the sacrificial drowning of 2 girls in the Nile during a flood festival honoring Hapi. He describes the crowd cheering as their bodies were pulled under the muddy water, chained to limestone blocks. The screams, he said, pleased the gods. The Nile rose that year. Priests called it a blessing. To the people of Thebes, these girls never existed. They were not named in official temple documents. Their bones, when found, lie in garbage pits behind sacred walls, mixed with ash, broken pottery, and burned offerings. No funerary rites, no tombs, no amulets to protect their spirits in the afterlife. Their names were erased as if to ensure even their souls would wander lost for eternity. Their lives were sacrifice, offered not just to gods, but to power, to silence, and to the greed that wore a priest's robe and a noble's ring. The house of women had no windows. What little light spilled inside came from narrow ceiling vents, barely wider than a fist, casting jagged shafts of sunlight that looked more like prison bars than blessings. The smell was permanent: salted sweat, rot, menstrual blood, and sour wine. They called it the temple stench, and it clung to skin even after a girl was bathed, if they ever bothered to clean her at all. Those who worked in the upper chambers were sometimes perfumed, laced with myrrh and lotus oil, not for dignity, but to cover the odor of decay hidden beneath their thighs. The girls rarely spoke. Their languages were different. Some were taken from the south, Nubians with thick braids and darker skin that priests called nightborn, while others were Syrians, Libyans, even Greek-speaking captives from coastal raids. Communication came through glances, twitches of the mouth, the angle of a shoulder, the tightening of fingers around clay bowls. They learned pain in all tongues. New arrivals were easy to spot. Their eyes searched too much. They flinched at sounds. Their skin had not yet hardened into that dry, cracking layer that old girls wore like armor. But the worst was the silence of those who had already broken. Girls who no longer reacted, no longer begged, no longer looked up. These were the ones closest to death. Their bodies still breathed, but everything that made them human had been taken. And in the House of Women, that was the goal. One girl named Tiaa, no more than 13, had been brought to the temple after her uncle sold her to pay a fine for tax evasion. She had been promised work as a maid. By the time she realized her true purpose, the door had already been bolted behind her. A priest named Nebuchadnezzar took special interest in her. He called her little priestess and insisted she be used only in high rituals. High rituals were worse than ordinary abuse. They involved more than just the body. They involved spirit, or so the priests claimed. During the Festival of Drunkenness, a celebration to honor the goddess Hathor, girls were paraded through the outer court as drums pounded and wine flowed like river water. Men from the royal guard, minor nobles, and temple servants drank until they collapsed or grew violent. Then the offerings began. Girls were dragged one by one into the center of the celebration and forced to perform under threat of lashings. The worst part wasn't the assaults, it was the laughter. The way the men cheered, the priests clapped, how even the older temple women turned their faces away and muttered that this was sacred duty, that Hathor would bless the land only if the girls did not resist. Tiaa resisted. The first time, she clawed at a priest's cheek so deeply that blood poured down his jawline. For that, she was punished with the ritual of Hotep Shady, a form of purification involving red-hot bronze plates pressed against the thighs. The priest's burn marks became her permanent branding. Spoiled, they called her after that. But some clients paid extra for girls who had been tempered by fire. There were no records kept of how many died during festivals. Temple scribes recorded only the outcome. The Nile has risen. The sun is pleased. The gods accept the blood. Those who did not survive were dragged to the rear sanctuary, known as Per Kefet, the House of Silence. It was not a temple. It was a pit. Bodies were stripped of jewelry, teeth of gold, and anything valuable, then dumped. Archaeologists have unearthed remains of over 200 girls in one such pit near Luxor, skulls crushed, pelvises fractured, some with copper amulets still clenched between broken fingers, as though they'd hoped the gods might still hear them. Sometimes priests argued over who had spiritual claim over a girl. When one girl from Hatti was declared both a sacred concubine to Amun and a slave womb, promised to Thoth's high priest, it sparked a conflict so vicious that the girl was simply mutilated and left in the Nile. Her body washed up 2 days later at a fishing village, where children found it bloated and torn. She was buried in silence by locals. That unmarked grave remains the only kindness she ever received. Even girls who reached maturity, rare as it was, found little reprieve. One such woman, Tiaa, had survived 5 temple cycles. She had birthed 2 children during rituals, both taken away. She was permitted to speak only to priests, and only when commanded. Her body was covered in old scars and branded symbols. When she turned 20, the temple labeled her as expired, no longer fertile, no longer desirable. The priests held a final ceremony for her, a simulated funeral. She was dressed in fresh linen, adorned in cheap gold, and paraded as if dead. Men were invited to offer final prayers through forced penetration. Afterward, her mouth was sewn shut, and she was taken beyond the temple gates. They said she wandered the desert until she died of heat or thirst. Her story ends there, not because it was uncommon, but because it was typical. For every Kia, every Tiaa, every nameless girl pulled from her home to be sacrificed to gods who never answered, thousands more followed. Their tears watered a civilization praised for its order and beauty. Their blood mixed into the mortar of temples tourists now admire with awe. History remembers pharaohs, but the girls beneath the stone, it forgets. The temple scribes liked to pretend that everything inside the House of Women was a matter of divine law. But the truth was simpler and uglier. It was an industry. Girls were a commodity, as interchangeable as jars of oil or baskets of grain. The priests wore gold collars and carried incense burners, but their hands were the hands of dealers. Every ritual had a price, every touch a transaction, every breath a calculation of value. The temple treasury overflowed, while the girls withered in darkness, unseen by the gods they were supposedly sacrificed for. The priests called it holy servitude. The city called it purification. The law called it property. The girls did not get to call it anything at all. The trade did not stop at the temple gates. Wealthy nobles often visited the House of Women under the guise of making donations, their gifts just a thin veil over purchase rights. A nobleman could pay for a girl's first. Breaking as a way to buy spiritual status, priests claimed that spilling of virgin's blood brought him closer to the gods. Surviving. Fragments of papyri from the court of Amenhotep III explicitly list payments. Grain, livestock, ingots of silver, carved alabaster jars, exchanged for the right to violate a child in the sight of temple witnesses. Records even show staged lotteries where men competed for the youngest or most unspoiled girls. Some were as young as 9. Priests referred to them clinically as unopened vessels, victims given titles instead of names. The priests designed the cruelty deliberately. A girl who still resisted was labeled wild. Those who trembled or cried too loudly were called disharmonious. But the ones who went limp, the ones whose minds retreated somewhere unreachable, were praised as spirit-broken, considered closest to divine obedience. Inscriptions hidden beneath plaster in Karnak describe approved training methods, forced binding positions for hours, starvation punishments, beatings that targeted the thighs and lower back to leave no obvious marks when viewed from a distance. Everything was crafted to break the body slowly, without killing it too soon. When a girl first arrived, she was examined like livestock. Temple physicians checked her teeth, hips, virginity, and skin. They looked for scars, moles, or deformities that might reduce her price. If she cried, she was slapped. If she begged for her family, she was gagged. No one left that inspection as a child. She left as inventory. Some were branded immediately. Others were collared. A few, usually foreigners captured in war, were tattooed with tiny hieroglyphs denoting their temple, Amun, Hathor, or Mut. The tattoos were placed low on the stomach or upper thigh, areas rarely covered by clothing during ritual ceremonies. Advertised like marks of ownership, girls too broken to work were put on display during feast days, mocked, touched, humiliated for the crowd's amusement. Men laughed as they stumbled or fainted. Wine was poured on their heads as priests claimed it cleansed the dirt of mortal sin. But afterward, those same girls were dragged away and used behind stone walls, while the crowd returned to dancing. There was no mercy for illness. The temple physicians treated wounds only to keep the girl usable. If infection spread too far, fever, tearing, rotting flesh, she was taken to the inner chamber called Pernesu, the king's silence. There she was, either suffocated under linen or drained of blood during what priests called a peaceful offering. The body was stripped of anything useful, hair for wigs, nails for charms, teeth for amulets, and bones sometimes crushed for ritual powder. What remained was thrown into refuse pits or buried in shallow sand behind the temple walls. Death was not the end of her service. Even her corpse was consumed. The temple's outer courts displayed carvings of goddesses in elegant poses, lotus flowers, birds in flight, symbols of beauty and cosmic order. Just behind those walls lay pits full of bones that told the truth. Order was built on suffering. Civilization was built on silence. There were rumors even among the temple workers, whispers of a secret chamber beneath Karnak, reserved for the most elite rituals. Girls chosen for those rites were never seen again. They were called brides of the god, but no marriage followed, only disappearance. Archaeologists later found narrow channels carved into the stone floors of those hidden chambers, too small for drainage of animals, perfectly sized for human blood. Whoever entered those rooms became an offering no one dared record. The greatest lie of ancient Egypt was not that the pharaoh was divine. It was that the offerings made to the gods were voluntary, that the gods accepted them, that heaven demanded suffering from the powerless. In truth, only men demanded it, cloaking cruelty in scripture. A girl in the house of women might live 2 years if she was lucky, 5 if she was obedient, 10 only if she learned how to stop existing inside her own skin. Tiaa had survived 6 months, 6 months of ritual and training, 6 months of bleeding and binding, 6 months of being reshaped into property. She had begun to speak less, to stiffen less at touch, to drift in and out of her body the way drowning people grow calm before death. The priests saw this as progress. They said she was ripening. Soon she would be given to the high festival of Opet, one of the largest ceremonial displays in Thebes. And during Opet, the most expensive offerings were made. She did not yet know what that meant, but the priests did, and they were already preparing her. During the days leading up to the Opet festival, the House of Women grew eerily quiet. It wasn't mercy, it was inventory. Priests walked the corridors like butchers counting cattle before slaughter, marking which girls were to be used for public rites and which would be kept hidden for private ceremonies, attended only by nobles and high-ranking priests. Each choice meant a different kind of death, slow or sudden, spiritual or physical, seen or unseen. The girls could always tell when a festival was coming. The air grew heavier, priests spoke in hushed tones, and guards stopped striking them for small mistakes, as if bruises were now a matter of preservation, not discipline. A girl with visible welts fetched less spiritual value. They needed her skin unbroken for the moment of spectacle. Tiaa was not beaten that week. Instead, she was given ritual baths, scalding water scented with lotus oil that burned her raw skin. Her body was scrubbed until it bled in places already bruised. Her hair, once thick and curling, had grown back enough since shaving that the priests cut it again, but this time with ornamental care. Softened edges, oiled strands, polished scalp. Ritual purity, they called it. Obedient body, empty womb. Perfect sacrifice. The priests told her nothing of what was coming. They never did. But she had lived inside the house long enough to read its rhythms. Some girls were bathed and painted before disappearing forever. Others were chained, starved, and whipped before being dragged into the crowd, where men tore them apart as if their screams were offerings. Rumors moved among the girls like wind, thin, frantic, never grounded long enough to grasp. One whispered that Opet required at least 3 virgins to be opened on the riverbank before the festival could begin. Another said high priests drank the first bleeding from a child's womb for divine clarity. A third said some girls were sealed alive inside tomb walls as living blessings for the pharaoh's passage through the city. None of these rumors felt like stories. They felt like truth waiting its turn. The first sign of what kind of fate awaited them came at dawn, 3 days before the Opet procession. A priest entered the chamber with a thin reed brush and a bowl of black pigment. One by one, he painted hieroglyphic marks on the girls' upper chests. Not their names. Girls were not allowed names anymore, but designations. Virgin, used, birthing, defiled, chosen. When he reached Tiaa, he paused longer than with the others. He drew a mark shaped like the rising sun over a broken hill. She did not know what it meant. But she recognized the look in the other girls' eyes when they saw it, and she understood. She was not being prepared for a man. She was being prepared for a god. That night, a low wail rippled through the sleeping room. Not from any individual throat, but from all of them at once, a trembling that passed bone to bone like a fever. No one spoke aloud. Yet all of them felt the same knowing, that Opet was not a festival of joy, but a harvest. And they were livestock chosen for its first reaping. Before dawn the next morning, they were paraded outside for moon cleansing. The temple courtyard was cold, the stone biting into their bare feet. Guards lined the perimeter. The sky still carried stars. The girls knelt in rows as a priest walked behind them with a torch, pressing its flame close enough to singe their backs. Symbolic purification, the temple scrolls would later call it. To the girls, it was branding without metal. When a girl flinched too hard, she was slapped. When one collapsed, she was dragged by the hair to the side and left shivering in the dust. They would either revive her or dispose of her. The temple did not waste time nursing damaged property. Inside the chamber afterward, Tiaa sat beside an older girl named Mehiet, whose eyes were clouded from repeated injury. Mehiet had survived Opet twice before. Survival meant only delay. Her voice was barely more than breath when she whispered, "When they call you, don't look at the sky." "Why?" Tiaa asked. "The gods do not look back." Those were the last words Mehiet ever spoke to her. The following day, Mehiet was taken to a separate chamber. The guards did not bother returning her mat to the room. The girls did not ask what had happened. They already knew. Disappearance always meant consumption, by ritual or by pit. When the final night before Opet fell, the House of Women was sealed from the outside. No torchlight, no whispers, only the muffled beat of ceremonial drums echoing from the grand court, as if the whole city were already celebrating what the girls had not yet endured. Tiaa lay awake, heart hammering. She remembered the night her uncle delivered her to the temple, how he swore she would polish brass bowls and sweep floors. She had believed him. She still saw his face in her nightmares, not the priest's. Betrayal always came before sacrifice. Outside, Thebes glittered with torches and silk banners, as if the gods had come to feast. Inside, dozens of girls waited in darkness, knowing they were the feast, and Opet had not even begun yet. The sun rose over Thebes with blinding arrogance, spilling gold across limestone walls, as if the city had nothing to hide. Drums echoed from the banks of the Nile, horns blared. Perfumed nobles lined the processional route, smiling behind shaded veils, their bodies wrapped in linen dyed brighter than flame. They had gathered not for worship, but for spectacle. The Opet festival had begun. Its purpose, officially, was to renew the bond between the pharaoh and the gods. But behind the chants and sacred hymns, behind the pounding of tambourines and the swaying priestesses dancing in slow circles, the truth squirmed like a worm beneath polished marble. Opet was about power, and power always demanded a body. Tiaa was chosen. At sunrise, she was taken from the sleeping chamber by two guards who didn't speak. Her arms were bound with linen cords, soaked in cedar oil to cleanse her spirit. Her eyes stung from the smoke of burning myrrh. She was led through a corridor she had never seen before, walls black with soot, etched with carvings of women kneeling before jackal-headed gods. Each one had her mouth open. Each one had no name. They brought her to a chamber carved directly into the stone beneath the eastern wing of the temple. The room stank of old blood and flowers that had rotted in their vases. 6 other girls stood inside, all painted in white chalk and scented with oils so thick it clung to their skin like syrup. No one spoke. No one cried. The silence was ritual now. A priest in gold-trimmed robes approached. His beard was braided. His hands held a scroll and a dagger, both sacred. He looked at Tiaa without seeing her. He called them the 7 Mouths of Hathor. That's what the temple had named them for this year's Opet rite. 7 girls, virgins, unspoiled, marked with divine purity. Each would be opened in one of the 7 stations of the festival. The temple gates, the sacred lake, the Amun sanctuary, the Queen's pavilion, the chamber of offerings, the base of the bark, and the riverbank. Tiaa was to be offered at the lake, in temple belief. The sacred lake was the womb of the universe, the place where creation began. And so, they said, a girl must be returned there. Not as a child, not even as a girl, but as an empty vessel. 2 elder priestesses painted symbols over her chest and thighs, using crushed malachite and blood. They sang softly in a dialect older than the pharaoh's tongue. One of them inserted a dried lotus pod between Tiaa's lips and whispered that it would keep her from speaking shame during the act. Tiaa did not resist. Resistance was no longer part of her vocabulary. When they brought her to the lake, the festival was already in full swing. People lined the banks, clapping to the rhythm of harps and drums. Painted dancers whirled past priests carrying gold statues. The pharaoh's ceremonial boat floated nearby, decorated in obsidian and ivory, guarded by warriors with spears and gazes that never dipped toward the water. At the lake's edge, a marble platform had been constructed, small, square, and stained darker near the center. Tiaa was lifted onto it by masked temple men whose feet never touched the water. The crowd didn't know her name. They didn't care. To them, she was not a girl. She was a symbol, a sacrifice, an anonymous offering to seal a 1,000-year covenant. But the gods did not speak. The priest beside her did. He recited prayers to Amun-Ra as 2 guards held her arms wide. The first cut was ceremonial, a shallow incision across the chest. Enough to bleed, not enough to die. Blood ran down her belly and into a small silver basin. They would mix it later with wine for nobles to drink, believing it would bring visions. Then came the second cut, not with a knife, but with the body of a high priest dressed in leopard skin, masked like a deity. He was not gentle. He was not slow. He was not human in that moment. The crowd roared, some clapped, some threw petals. Some wept in ecstatic joy. A few closed their eyes as if what they witnessed was too holy to see, though they never looked away for long. Tiaa bit down on the lotus pod. Her body buckled, but her arms were tied to the stone with rope soaked in salt water. She could feel the platform beneath her growing slick. The blood did not stop. The priest did not stop. When it was done, she was not offered comfort. She was lifted and carried toward the sacred lake, where temple scribes dipped her feet into the water, anointing it with her blood. A single priestess took a vial and poured a drop of oil between her legs. Symbolic healing, they called it. She was left there for hours. not dead. Not awake, just breathing, just bleeding. When night came, the scribes returned. They unbound her arms, wrapped her in a linen that barely covered her thighs, and whispered that she had completed the rite. She would now serve in the inner sanctum, reserved for nobles and generals. No longer for gods. The gods had taken what they needed. Now the men would take what was left, and in the house of women, a new girl was already being scrubbed for next year's Opet. After Opet, Tiaa did not return to the same chamber she had come from. Girls who had been given to the god were never sent back among the unbroken. They were considered initiated, their value permanently altered. But value never meant safety, only different hands holding the leash. She was taken to what the priests called the inner house, a smaller wing hidden behind 2 sets of stone doors. Outsiders believed this chamber was for honored temple musicians and singers, women of sacred rank. In truth, it was where the temple stored those the gods had already tasted, kept alive only so men could finish what religion had begun. The girls there were quieter, thinner, not because they feared punishment, but because they had reached a stage beyond fear. Their eyes no longer searched, not for escape, not for compassion, not for memory. They simply existed until someone required their body. The inner house was worse than the outer one, in a way that could not be seen, only felt. The air was too still. The girls moved like ghosts, and the priests smiled more often here, because here there was nothing left to tame. Food was slightly better, gruel instead of stale scraps, but the price of that mercy was access. Officials came at night, claiming divine privilege. They did not pretend to pray first. They did not perform ritual chanting. They just took. No one argued. No one refused. Tiaa learned quickly that a priest's footsteps meant bracing her body, lying still, waiting for it to end, not because she was willing, but because fighting did nothing except lengthen the night. They avoided her face at first. She was still fresh, still ritually marked. Later, when swelling and tearing faded into scar tissue, their touches grew rougher. The scent of her blood during Opet had been sacred. The scent of her blood now was considered routine. There were no windows here either, but she could hear the world. The laughter of nobles outside the temple walls, the distant splash of oars on the Nile, the barking of dogs in the marketplace. Fragments of life she would never return to. The city thrived just beyond the limestone, vibrant and bright, pretending its happiness was not built on bones. Priests told the girls they should feel honored. They said this was service to eternity, that every act of suffering brought order to the world, that Egypt's greatness depended on their silence. If a girl faltered, a priest would lift her chin and whisper soft poison, "Without your sacrifice, the sun would not rise." Guilt was another chain, stronger than... And sometimes, high-ranking officers from the palace harem came to inspect the temple girls, choosing a handful to be transferred into royal service. Outsiders believed a place in the pharaoh's harem was a promotion. It was not. It only meant the cage had more silk. Women there lived under heavier guard, and punishments were worse because they risked defiling royal blood. But being chosen meant surviving longer than the temple pits. And so some prayed for it. Tiaa was never chosen, not because she lacked beauty, but because temple priests did not want to lose her. The mark placed on her for Opet designated her as recurring ritual property, too valuable to give away. It meant she belonged not to a man, but to the altar. It meant she would bleed again and again, until she broke. Her world shrank to a sequence of sounds, sandals against stone, incense burners scraping metal stands, the slow inhale of a priest just before he pushed her into stillness. Days bled into nights. Seasons turned but never touched her. A full moon passed, then another. Ritual season came again. The temple physicians inspected her body the way farmers inspect cracked pottery, checking if she could still hold what they needed from her. They said she had healed well. Healed did not mean repaired, only functional. When the next ceremony approached, smaller than Opet but no less violent, she understood without being told. The lake had been first breaking. The next would be deeper. Something shifted in her then, not rebellion, not panic, absence. The soft, young part of her that once trembled or asked why vanished. There was no voice left inside her to scream. The temple had stolen even her inner witness, and this was precisely what they wanted, because a body without a self could be offered again and again without cost. One night, before the next rite, she overheard two priests speaking outside the chamber door, not in secrecy, but casually, like discussing lumber or cattle feed. "This one will not last another festival," one said. "Then she will be taken below," the other replied. "If she dies in silence, the gods will receive her well, taken below." The phrase lodged into her mind like a thorn. The girls had whispered of it, the place beneath the temple where no chanting could be heard. No festival drums reached, no bodies returned. The place where offerings were finished, the place where the pit lived. Tiaa had survived ritual. She had survived men. She had survived Opet, but the pit did not let anything survive. The next ceremony was only days away. The days before the next ritual passed like a fever dream, slow, airless, and sticky with dread. In the inner house, the atmosphere was not filled with panic. Panic belonged to those who still believed escape was possible. Here the girls prepared in silence, bodies moving through practiced routines as their minds drifted far from the stone walls. They bathed each other. They braided hair. They whispered prayers that weren't prayers at all, just soft reminders to one another that they still existed. Tiaa said nothing. She hadn't spoken in days. Her body functioned on reflex now. She walked when told, knelt when commanded, opened her legs when the priests gestured, but her mind had retreated somewhere deeper than even pain could reach. She was not asleep but not awake either, somewhere in between, where thoughts could not find her, and memories no longer mattered. This state pleased the priests, one of them, an old man with rotting teeth and a voice like crumbling papyrus, referred to her as the perfect vessel. Not because she was beautiful, though she still was in the way youth clung to her body like an afterthought, but because she had ceased to resist. Resistance complicated rituals. It was loud. It bled wrong. The gods, they said, demanded purity of spirit, and what was more pure than obedience, carved out by suffering. 3 nights before the ceremony, she was taken to the preparation chamber. There she was stripped, washed, and painted again. Symbols were etched across her breasts and belly with red ochre. A shaved priestess smeared her skin with animal fat to make her glow under torchlight. Her hair, what had grown back since Opet, was recut into a straight line across her scalp. She was reborn, they said, ready for return, but this ritual wasn't like the one before. It wasn't for the crowds. This one would be private, personal, permanent. 2 other girls were being prepared beside her. Both younger. One coughed constantly, blood in the corner of her lips. The other stared blankly at the wall, muttering the same phrase in a foreign tongue over and over. Neither made it through the final night. By morning their beds were empty. No one explained where they had gone. Tiaa didn't ask. That afternoon she was brought to the lower sanctum, a forbidden chamber beneath the hall of offerings. Only the highest-ranking priests carried the keys. No music played down here. No incense masked the air. The torchlight flickered against damp walls that dripped with cold moisture, carved long ago with scenes of ritual harvests and divine exchange. The pit was real. It wasn't deep, only 5 or 6 feet, but its mouth was wide, ringed with bronze plates stained dark from centuries of blood. Stone channels fed into it from all sides, some dry, others caked with old rot. Above it hung a beam with 2 rusted shackles. Tiaa recognized this place, not from experience, but from the stories whispered in the House of Women, the ones girls were warned not to repeat. The final chamber, the last altar, the place where offerings were consumed fully and finally so that the gods might never hunger again. 3 priests entered. One held a ceremonial blade, its hilt shaped like a lotus. Another carried a scroll, old, flaking, written in a dead dialect that sounded more animal than human. The third priest was the one she feared most, the silent one. The one who had marked her at Opet. He never touched the girls himself, but always watched, eyes dull, face like dried clay. He watched now, too. 2 temple guards stood behind her, though they didn't need to. She didn't move. They tied her hands above her head, wrists in the shackles, feet barely touching the stone floor. Her body sagged forward, hips aching, blood already running down the inside of her thighs from old wounds, reopened. The priest began to read, not to her, to the gods. The words meant nothing to her ears, but their rhythm struck her bones. She remembered those sounds from long ago, before the first ritual, when she still had a name. They had been read over her body then too, words of blessing, words of surrender. The blade came out next. Not for her throat, she was too valuable to kill quickly, but for the offering. They cut across her thighs again, just below the hips where the scars were thickest. Not deep, but wide enough to bleed freely. The blood was collected in golden bowls and stirred with wine, pomegranate, and powdered resin. A cup of it was poured into the pit. Another was poured down her chest. The third was passed to the priest with the scroll, who drank without expression. It wasn't death. Not yet. It was ritual. The pain didn't even reach her properly anymore. She felt it like sound, dull and distant, as if someone else was being carved open nearby, and she was only witnessing it from a cracked mirror. When they were done, they lowered her to the floor, untied her wrists, carried her like a statue to the edge of the pit. They whispered the final chant. She didn't understand it, but the tone said everything. Goodbye. They did not kill her. They simply pushed her in. Not hard. Not with malice. Just enough. Her body landed in a pool of congealed blood and flower petals, the scent so thick it made her gag. She lay there, unable to stand. The walls around her dripped. Bones floated nearby. She reached for one without thinking, her fingers closing around a rib that had once belonged to a girl like her. They left the torchlight above, so she could see. They wanted her to see, because they would return, not to retrieve her, but to offer her again, until her voice, her mind, her breath, all of it, became as still and silent as the bones she now held. The pit did not kill her quickly. That was never its purpose. It was not a grave. It was a waiting room for death, a place where a girl's body softened, weakened, emptied itself of the last traces of defiance before the priests returned to finish her. Some died within hours from blood loss. Others lasted days, slowly fading in the filth until their hearts gave out. The priests claimed that the longer a girl lived in the pit, the more pleasing her final surrender became to the gods. Tiaa lived 3 days. She drifted in and out of consciousness, slipping between pain and a numb, dreamless void. Thirst burned her tongue. Fever rattled her bones. The wound on her thigh split open a second time when she tried to lift herself into a sitting position, and she stopped trying after that. Her whole body trembled from cold and exhaustion, but her mind had gone far past fear. There was no before anymore, no memory of childhood, no possibility of after. There was only now, and now was a slow drowning inside her own skin. She was not alone in the pit, scattered bones pressed against her side when she shifted. Fragments of rib cage, finger bones, the smooth curve of a skull half buried in dried blood. Whoever those girls were, the temple had erased their names, their families, their histories, but not their remains. They were proof that this fate wasn't accident or exception. It was design. On the second night she heard movement above, not priests this time, but another girl being dragged down the corridor, whimpering weakly. The priests paused at the mouth of the pit, muttered a chant, then pushed the girl inside. She landed beside Tiaa with a cracked sob. Her breath came in jagged bursts until exhaustion forced her into unconsciousness. By morning she was dead. Tiaa didn't cry, not because she lacked grief, but because there was nothing left inside her capable of rising to the surface. Her tears had been emptied long ago, first by fear, then by ritual, then by repetition. Pain had become a language she no longer translated. On the 4th morning, footsteps returned, slow, unhurried, ceremonial. The priests had come to finish the offering. Two of them peered down into the pit, their expressions blank, as if assessing a piece of pottery, too cracked to sell, but still useful as sacrificial debris. A ladder was lowered. They descended not to lift her gently, but to grasp her beneath the arms and drag her upward. Her head lolled against her shoulder. She could not feel the stone scraping her shins. She did not understand she was leaving the pit. She only understood when she was laid upon a slab, smoother than the one from Opet, colder, polished for the final rite. A brazier burned beside her, thick with sweet resin, meant to mask the smell of open wounds. The chamber was small, lit by flickering oil lamps carved into the shape of lotus petals. 3 priests surrounded her. One read from a scroll, one held a ceremonial blade, one watched in silence. The same watcher from Opet. They did not speak to her. They spoke over her. She was not a person, she was an object. Passing through its final stage of usefulness, the ritual was called Per Nesu, Neferu, the perfect release. The priests taught that a girl's final breath became an offering that nourished the divine. They even recorded it as a life fulfilled, though the average fulfillment ended before 16. The blade pressed gently first, not enough to cut, just enough to bless. Then the chanting shifted. The true cut came swift, clean, deliberate, not the messy slicing of festival spectacle, but a priest's practiced hand, severing the last thread between flesh and breath. She did not scream. She did not resist. Her body jerked once, reflexive, then slackened, not because she accepted death, because they had already killed everything inside her long. Before her heart stopped, her blood flowed down a carved channel that led straight into the pit. Completing the cycle, her body was not given burial, no shroud, no amulet, no name. She was carried behind the sanctum and left in a refuse trench with others like her. A pile of girls, erased so completely that history would later call them myth. Servants, decorations, temple attendants. They were none of those things. They were sacrifices laid at the foundation of empire. Flesh turned into piety. Suffering turned into ceremony. Silence turned into theology. The priests would continue the rites next season. Another girl would be chosen. Another pit would fill. The gods would stay silent. The city would stay proud, and Egypt, the empire that carved eternity into stone, built its holiness on the bones of children it refused to remember. The temples survived. The girls did not, yet their silence walks beneath. Every monument still standing, a shadow trapped under polished stone, a wound disguised as worship, a debt no god ever asked for. But men insisted must be paid. Their story was never written in scrolls, but it was written in them, and their bones are still telling it.